Good morning, Coalition. It's great to have everybody with us, I should say. And we have an extra special interview this morning, Dr. Stuart Altman, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But first, I'm going to ask Virginia to give us a couple of announcements about what's coming up in the next few weeks.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. First, a reminder that our monthly meeting will be a joint meeting with the Coalition on Aging. You should have received an updated calendar invite that will be for April 22nd, which does differ from the 15th, which it originally was for. We're really excited for this, and we're working on a great lineup of speakers. So more to come later. Also, thank you for your continued work on the progress report. I believe each work group has received the latest draft from Shane. So if you could, please review and provide your feedback to him at your earliest convenience. And lastly, we have some great events coming up. Yesterday was part one of our advanced care planning webinars with AHEC, and we have the second webinar coming up next Thursday. That's with Dr. Jonathan Fisher as the presenter. If you want more information, the flyer is posted on our website. That's all.
All right. Thank you, Virginia. So as promised, we have a very, very special interview this morning. Dr. Stuart Altman has been described as one of the most important individuals in healthcare economics and really in healthcare in the United States living today. And I think that is absolutely true. He has been an advisor to 5 presidents. He's written a book on power politics and just one of his books, and universal healthcare. And he is simply an icon that I have revered for many, many years. But first of all, Dr. Altman, what we'd like to do is just get into your background a little bit. So if you could just tell us about what it was like growing up as a young man.
Well, wow. So I suspect what I'm going to talk, my life has absolutely nothing to do with most, if not all of you. I'm almost guaranteed of that. I'm a product of the 1940s and 1950s as a young man. My parents were wed and grew up during the Great Depression, and they actually met at a job they both worked for. And I grew up in the Bronx in New York City, in a big 5-story, and had a very nice childhood. We were our own little ecosystem. There were like within 2 or 3 buildings, there must have been 15 boys, and mostly boys and some girls who were my age. And I grew up, just enjoying it. I was very young during the Second World War, but I do remember little things about it. But I'm really a product of the 1950s. I went to a community high school. I was supposed to go to the sort of fancy high-end high school called Bronx Science, which is world famous. But one of those little things in your life where I had a little girlfriend at the time, and she said, "You're going to go with all those geeks into science, and I'm not sure I'm going to stay with you." Well, for a 14-year-old, that was devastating. So I agreed to stay at the community high school. And while I was there, I had an aunt who worked downtown in Manhattan at a big finance company. And at the age of 16, I began to commute from my little place in the Bronx down to Park Avenue and 46th Street. And I was taken by the excitement of Manhattan and finance. And my father, who was not wealthy to say the least, but believed in the American, even having come through the Depression, was still a believer in the American capitalist system, and taught us on how the stock market worked. And we used to do it on paper because he didn't have enough money to invest in it. So I got caught up in the finance world. And when it came time to go to college, having come from a family of limited means, going to a private school was out of the question. Fortunately for us, growing up in New York, we had a wonderful public college system called the City College of New York. And most people don't know this, but up through the mid 1950s, there were more graduates of City College that went on to get a PhD than any other school in the country.
Wow.
It was a phenomenal in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And still today, it's a wonderful school for new entrants into America. I serve on the board of advisors of the college that I graduated from, and you'd be amazed. I mean, it's kids from all over the world who are trying to make it in this country and get better educated. Anyway, I went to what's called, at that point, the Baruch School, which was part of the City College of New York.
Mm.
And I became, and to major in finance. So that, and I would commute every day. I lived in the Bronx. The City College was on, if you know anything about Manhattan, is on 23rd and Lexington Avenue. So I would take the subway down there early in the morning. I remember those 8 o'clock classes and having to be down there by 7:30. And as far as I was concerned, when I got off the subway, my day was over. That was the hardest part, fighting the subway. So anyway, it was a good childhood. I worked hard. And in 1958, you may have heard this, you probably weren't or even born then.
Yes, I was.
The Russians set up their first satellite,
Mm-hmm.
and it was called Sputnik, and America panicked and developed a major investment in science. And economics was considered, and still is, one of the sciences. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of graduate scholarships and fellowships available. So when I graduated college in 1959, I said, I want to go to graduate school. I want to get a PhD in economics. I want to learn more about it. So anyway, one of the flukes in life, and if you have a good opinion of me, David, I suspect by the time this interview is over, you will change your mind.
Not a chance.
I'll show you both how naive I am, but how life has some good turns as well. So having grown up in the Bronx and lived in Manhattan, I wanted to see the country. I wanted to learn about this country. And I said, I'm going to apply to graduate schools, but I want to apply. So I applied to colleges in Chicago, but I really wanted to go to California. I've been hearing all about California. I had never been west of the Hudson River, if you know anything about Manhattan, and so I said, I'm going to apply to the University of California. Well, shows you what I know. I didn't know there was a difference between the University of California at Berkeley and the University of California in Los Angeles, UCLA. To me, it was the University of California.
Sure.
So I got an application and I applied to the University of California thinking that and then I got accepted into their graduate economics program. And well, it turned out the school that I applied to was not Berkeley, but UCLA. And by the time I found out about that, it was too late to reapply to Berkeley. So there I was, committed to go out to UCLA in Southern California. Now, I had been dating a wonderful woman, and you know, I was all of 21 and she was 20. And I said, you know, let's get married, and would you be willing to come with me to California? And she said yes. And when I graduated in 1959, the two of us packed up in a 1953 Dodge Coronet and drove across this great country of ours. And I was just awed by this. The interstate was just being built.
Mhm.
So we would go on Route 80 and then 70 for a while, but did a lot of back roads. And then went into the Rockies and went to the national park. That was our honeymoon, was learning about this country. And it was fascinating. I have since traveled this country more times than I can count. So that was my early childhood. So if you want, I'll just go a little longer to explain how I wound up in healthcare.
Yeah, please do. And by the way, UCLA isn't such a bad school. My dad went
No,
there.
and it was just began. Oh, I can't. Now I have to tell you. So I went to this school on 23rd and Lexington Avenue, which was an 18 or 19-story building. No campus. We painted the 9th floor green so that it looked like that was our campus. And then I went out to UCLA and I go, oh my God, this is unbelievable. This big campus and people are going around, and you know, it was, and this was a good time in America. We had the 50s was you know, we had come out of the war. We were a strong country. Some people say that we were a little boring, that, you know, but it was a good time in America. And I was just fascinated. And having a young wife, and the two of us, we rented a little place on the outs between Los Angeles and Beverly Hills, an absolutely wonderful little place. And I bought a little Renault Dauphine car, and we were both very happy campers. Thank you. But what I didn't realize, while that economics department had really welcomed me, it turned out to be a very conservative economics department. It was a very good economics department in terms of training students in the classical economics. But I knew zilch about policy, and I'd never been to Washington. How ironic. And so I was trained, and they didn't believe in government. They believed in the marketplace, which was all well and good. And then it came time to write a dissertation. This is 1962. And I'm a little bit of a, I wouldn't say I break a lot of rocks, but I push the envelope occasionally.
You've done that throughout your career.
And I said, you know, there are all these women coming into the labor force. I'd like to learn more. I want to be a labor economist. I said, I'd like to learn more about women in the labor force. And I'll never forget this. The actually chairman of the department said, oh, women are secondary workers. They're not important. Why don't you focus on something else?
Wow.
I said, I don't want to focus on something else. And so I said, I want to focus on the unemployment of married women. Now, I can't even remember why I picked that component of women in the labor force. And so soon after I started my dissertation, I just want to show you life is just, there was a national competition for 40 young economists to come back to Goucher College in Maryland and learn about health policy and what was going on in Washington. And I won that award, and I came back and I met a senior member of the Federal Reserve who said to me, we want to know more about women in the labor force. We think this is an important, and would you be willing to come back to Washington on our expense? We will give you a very substantial, at that time, I think it was $8,000 opportunity, and you could write your dissertation and be a senior fellow at the Federal Reserve.
Wow.
I said, wow. So I went back to UCLA and I said to my advisors, I want to go to Washington and write my, oh, they said, don't do that. Oh, Washington is a terrible place. And if you go there, you'll never write your dissertation. I said, I don't believe that. I said, they're very nice. It'll be a wonderful opportunity. So anyway, the two of us, my wife at that point was now pregnant with what was to become our first child. And we set it in this little Renault Dauphine, 1963, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here we were driving to Washington and listening on the radio the potential for this country to be attacked. I had a little bottle of vodka in the middle of the Renault just in case, but I was going to Washington. So anyway, went to Washington, wrote my dissertation. And one of the other flukes in life, I got a letter that said, we understand that you're a labor economist. This was from the Pentagon. And they said, we are pulling together a team. Secretary McNamara, which I'm sure many of you have heard of and probably don't have good feelings about him. And by the way, while I was there, President Kennedy was assassinated. And I remember going to the funeral march. It was really something. And Lyndon Johnson became president. Anyway, he said, we're pulling together a group to study whether this country can have an all-volunteer military. Now, I'd been in the military. I had flunked Boy Scouts. But there was something that said, gee, I'd like to learn about what this group is, what's going on there. I'm not like, I've always been like that. And I said, okay, I finished my degree in June of 1964 and went over and joined this group, which turned out to be absolutely wonderful. I met very smart, of a cross-section of America, a whole group of young, mostly economists and analysts. You probably have never heard of them, but one of them went on to, he was become a very famous health person. Anyway, while I was there, Vietnam began to blow up. Because I was a new father, 26 years old, I didn't have to go in, but I wound up hiring a bunch of young people who are in the military to work with me. Anyway, while I'm there, and then the war began to play out, and I'm getting more uncomfortable. I didn't come to the Pentagon to get involved in wars, and I said, I got to get out of here.
Mm.
So two things, and then I'm going to stop because it'll show what happened. I said, I want to try academics. And I, after looking around, received a offer to become an advanced assistant professor at Brown University in their economics department.
Hmm.
And the rest of, now here's the important part, the rest of my group, the guy who ran it, a wonderful man by the name of Bill Gorham, who had been at Rand Corporation in Santa Monica and then ran it. He was offered, by this time, Johnson had moved forward, and a fellow by the name of Joe Califano, who's now very involved with the disabled, was his advisor, and they created in every department in Washington an assistant secretary for planning and evaluation to make sure that the programs that we have work. And my boss was offered the assistant secretary in what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, I went to Brown, but they all went with him. And I went to Brown and, was economics. And about 6 months after I got there, I got a call from one of the guys that I had worked with in the Pentagon. And they said, this is sort of funny, and hopefully you'll get a kick out of it. They said, hey, Stuart, you know all about women in the labor force. Yeah, right. They said, we got a problem with nurses.
Still do.
Yeah. I said, well, what's the problem? They said, well, in 1967, we passed a major growth for physicians, by the way. I'm going to get very involved in it, where we're requiring the number of physicians in this country to double. And we're putting a lot of money, federal money, into building up our physicians. And the nurses want the same thing. They want money to build up the number of nurses. And we don't know what to do, whether to do it or not. Come to Washington and help us think through this thing. And that, I said, well, okay, I'll come to Washington. And I came to Washington for an advisory group and got caught up. And then I said to the people in Brown, I'm going to take a sabbatical and go to Washington. And I wrote a book on the future supply of nurses that got involved. And many of you may know this, with the whole issue of whether the diploma schools of nursing would continue and what would happen to the future of nursing. And Catherine, so this is your life, right?
It is, and I was in nursing school at that time. So
you
now
see that? You see, we linked up.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, it looks like diploma schools are going to close in large numbers. Anyway, you can go back and maybe dust off a copy. I published this book on the future supply in 1970, 71, something like that. And anyway, one final piece of this, and then I'll stop. You can ask other questions. While I was in Washington finishing the book, by this time, Richard Nixon had become president.
Mm-hmm.
and one of the flukes of all flukes in life. And my boss and that group that I talked about left HEW and formed a group which is now called the Urban Institute. And he became the president. He was wonderful, man. The president of the Urban Institute. And he said to me, Stuart, why don't you come back? Because I'd gone back to Brown and have another sabbatical. And he offered me a senior, advisory group at the Urban Institute. And by this time, I finished the book and I began to get a little involved in what's healthcare. We didn't have healthcare economics. There was no healthcare economics.
You invented it.
Well, in a little sense, yeah. Me and I recruited two people that became world famous. One, Uwe Reinhardt, and the other, Gail Walensky, who went on to run Medicare. And so those two people, I said, hey, and I won't go into it how I met them, but I said, I think healthcare is here to stay. And anyway, what happened, this is the fluke. While all of my friends from the Pentagon had left HEW, one of them stayed. And he worked with the then assistant secretary. And they said, we're looking for someone to become the deputy assistant secretary for health policy in this country. And now this is the Nixon administration, and I'm sure you have heard awful things, and I would agree with them. But, and this is a big but, there was a group at HEW who had come from California, who were you would think of as the liberal arm of the Republican Party. And of course, I don't know anything about it. I'm sorry, I will admit this. I was so busy with my life, I really was not involved in politics very much. And it's a interesting story in and of itself. I wound up becoming the deputy assistant secretary for health policy at HEW. And it turned out, if you know anything about the history of healthcare in America, and I served in that role from 1971 to 1976. And I helped write, you're going to find this hard to believe, but if you read my book, and you could probably buy it for $2. A lot of my students have probably turned it in. But I go through the history, and in a fluke of all flukes, the Nixon administration put together a universal health insurance plan, which ultimately became the basis for the Romney Plan in Massachusetts and the Affordable Care Act passed by Obama in 2010. And I was a very important part of writing that bill. And I got involved in nursing supply and, as I said, doubling the supply of physicians. We created the HMO Act, which brought managed care into this country. We created what was called the Health Planning and Resource Development Act throughout the United States to put health planning and certificate of need involved. It was, aside from the passage of Medicare and Medicaid in 1966, and maybe the Affordable Care Act in 2010, it was the most productive period of health policy in this country in its entirety. And I was right in the middle of it. And there I was, this fluky kid who really knew very little, but boy, I learned. And it was a relatively small group. Now there are thousands in Washington. And of course, I've been there 100 times, if not 1,000. but it was a wonderful experience and it changed my life. I gave up my Brown position because I wanted to stay there and do it. And then I wound up, after it was over, going to the University of California, now at Berkeley, as a visiting faculty, and then eventually moved to become the dean of the Heller School at Brandeis. So with that, I'm going to stop.
Well, that is, you have put your fingerprints on American healthcare and health policy and economics all over the place. And we are so privileged to be able to have you on this interview. And we've got to ask you to come back because you've just taken us through the first half of that experience. So
I will be glad to come back. It's a pleasure to meet you, David. And I've heard from my daughter, Heather, what wonderful things you're doing and this association. Heather couldn't be more excited to be part of it.
well,
And so I'd be glad to be helpful.
wonderful. So just give us, I understand you have one anecdote about when you think we're going to get universal health care in this country.
Well, I'll tell you the bad story and the good story. You probably have heard this about this young fellow who unfortunately dies. And he goes up and he meets the great master up there and he said, "Oh, great master," he asked the same question: when will America have true universal coverage? And the great master says, "It will happen, but not in my lifetime." Well, I don't want to be irreligious, and I'm sure but I am hopeful that we will eventually, and I've been working on it for 50 years. It'll not look like anything it'll be a uniquely American system. For those of you who are strong single payer people, I doubt that's what it will look like. It's the reason why I believe in the Affordable Care Act to my bottom of my toes. I'm a big believer and I've worked with the Biden people to make it better, and we need to make it better again. But every country, if you know the history, every country develops their universal system along different lines and along their own history. There is no one model. But what other countries have done, and we have not, is that they have protected all of their citizens, and we need to do that. But again, I do believe it'll be done in a uniquely American way, but it's going to take a few more years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you wrote a book about 5 years ago, I believe, called Power Politics and Universal Healthcare. And so I would encourage all of our listeners to grab that and take a look at it. But
David, if you don't mind, I'm going to give a copy of this to Heather, and she will give it to you as my gift. So
thank you. Thank you very much. Sign it, please.
I will definitely sign it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Unfortunately, we've got to stop, but I know everyone has just been fascinated with this walk through American health policy, and we wish you the best, and we want you to come back.
So, as I said, I'm here. I would love it.
All right. And we're very fortunate to have your daughter as part of our group.
All right. Well, you are fortunate because I love her. She's the better part of me, I'll tell you.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care.
Have a great weekend.
Okay.